Welcome, everybody, to episode 1 of the finest podcast to ever tickle your eardrums. The podcast where we answer the deepest, burning philosophical question of life. What's on your workbench? Welcome, everyone. I am Chili from Orwood Solutions, and with me on not only the other side of the microphone, but the other side of the world is Andrew from Crafty Beetroot. Andrew, how are you doing today, friend?
I'm doing good. It is a beautiful morning here in Australia, and we have got the first cool morning, I think, in about 6 months. So this morning, my run, I wasn't actually completely dead from sweating. So it's very awesome. It's kind of like that. What's this feeling? Oh, I'm kind of cool. This is nice. So how about yourself, Chili? How are you doing over there? Has things started to warm up?
Yeah, it was like 60 some degrees yesterday, and it's like a high of 40 today with the possibility of snow again. So,
Perfect weather.
Just another beautiful week in Colorado. Never know what's coming, but it's been great. It's starting to warm up, which is good because I'm itching to take the paddle boards out again.
Nice. I was thinking before, I'm like, I can't wait till you're working on your next paddleboard and we can talk about those.
Yeah, I may have some to make this season. I got a couple of folks who have been tickling my ears about it.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah. So I have one really important question for you today, Andrew. What's on your workbench?
Oh, I'm glad you asked, Chili. So this is probably the project that started this whole idea. I think I alluded it to last week's episode. I was working on this in the workbench, and it was just one of those things where I was like, man, I wish I knew somebody that knew a little bit more about wood and metal and, just actually knew what they were doing, because I could probably use their help on this. And here we are. And so this sat on my workbench for a couple of weeks, but it actually sat in my brain as an idea for months and months and months. So as this isn't a podcast, I will try my hardest to describe what the project was. And for those that are watching on YouTube, you'll just get to be able to see it. But basically, I had an apple slicer. So for those of you not familiar, you can pick up these apple slicers pretty well everywhere. They slice an apple into 8 pieces and they core it. And if you have kids, they're great because you want your kids to eat apples, and instead of having to peel it, well, you still have to peel it, but instead of having to slice it and core it and do that, it does it all in one big motion. But as you can imagine, that's a lot of force on the device that you're using. And so we had a cheap plastic one that we were using for, it must have been almost 3 or 4 years. And it eventually got a crack and it fell apart. And so it basically sat in our drawer, broken and still being used. So we bought a replacement, and that wasn't as good. So we bought another replacement, and I noticed that we were still using the broken one because that was our favorite one. And the other two just weren't cutting it, if you know what I mean. And so my wife went, that's enough. We're throwing it out. Done with that. We can't use it anymore. It's broken. Throw it in the bin. And then I went to the bin and just grabbed that out and went and put it on my workbench. And my idea was get rid of the plastic, get some wood, and basically embed that cutting steel, because it's basically almost like a star of thin sheet metal with a rough blade on it, and embed that in wood. And with wood, something like this I think is great in wood because you can like sand it back whenever you need, you can refinish it, you can reshape it if it doesn't quite fit what you want. And so that's what I did over the course of a couple of weekends. I basically got a piece of wood. I found a piece of scrap wood from the top of an old set of drawers, like bedside table. Just pine, nothing too exotic, and proceeded to shape it. So initially I just used a jigsaw, cut out the rough shape, and a hole saw to cut out the center. And then I used the jigsaw to clean up the center. And then because I don't have a belt sander or a disc sander, I used my favorite technique of getting a sanding disc in a drill and using that for most of the shaping. I usually use like an 80 grit to like 120 grit, usually my choice of grits, just to kind of hog it out. And then I basically had to try and figure out how to add the blades. So the blades was probably the hardest part to add because given the angles and the shapes involved, I ended up just using like a finishing saw because it's got a nice thin blade, whatever you call these. That's a Japanese saw, backward cutting saw, something like that. I use the technical terms. That's why we have an expert on. And I use that to cut like a nice thin edge. And then I actually use the blades themselves to kind of force them in. And then finally, I just use super glue to hold it in place. I was thinking of using a 2-part epoxy, but in the end, I was just like, I can't be bothered mixing up a whole bunch and pouring it in there. And I'm like, I think the super glue will last. And if it pops out, I know how to fix it. And then finally, I finished it with a wood burn. Just got the butane torch on it, and then I linseed oil. So this is, for those that are on the video, this is what it looks like, and it looks pretty good if I don't say so myself.
I really like how that turned out. I think it looks great.
Yeah, no, I was pleasantly surprised because when I was working on the initial shaping, it just wasn't coming together for me. And then, you know, I hit it with the torch and it actually brought it all together. And the nice thing with hitting it with that torch, which is a finish that I've never used before, but you see it all the time, is it cleaned up a lot of my imperfections. So like little bits of raggedy bits that, you know, I'm not going to sand it down to 400 grit or anything. I'm not that guy. And yeah, and it just cleaned it up, finished it off, and actually exposed some really cool wood aspects. So I'm thinking that this bit here, for those of you that can't see, there's kind of like a blemish on the wood, but it almost looks like it's a branch that was coming out at some point of that wood or something. And yeah, giving that wood finish just absolutely brought that out. So that was the project, and it is now finished. So it does now sit in our drawer. It's no longer on my workbench. But I have a couple questions for you, Chili, about this. So given that that was my goal, was to make this to be able to be used, if you could do a perfect wood for this kind of use, what would be the wood you would do? How would have you manufactured that kind of really weird, complex shape? And I guess, how would have you finished that wood to make sure it would last in the kitchen and, you know, children abusing it and things like that?
Yeah. So I actually really like pine for that project. The reason being is that the tensile strength of pine is high, but it's flexible. It will move. And the way that you use that apple core, you know, you have upward resisting pressure in the middle and your downward pressure on the outsides. And you really want to have some flex in it. Otherwise, it's going to be prone to snapping. So I actually really like pine for that application. Of course, you could use, you know, any number of, you know, woods under the sun. And I think it would work fine. The other reason I like pine, though, is it's not a very porous wood. So you're not going to be as worried about getting foodstuffs on a microscopic level, you know, into the wood grain. So I think that that's a pretty solid choice. If I was going to use anything else, I would probably go with maybe sugar maple, hard maple. You see that used in cutting boards a lot. And that's because it's also a not very porous wood. The wood grain, the little tubes that make wood grain are actually very small. So that would probably be the other thing I might use. In terms of shaping, I probably would, you know, rough it out with a handsaw, get my very rough shape in, and then from there I'd go to some files and rasps. Like I have a set of rasps for they're commonly used by shipwrights to get those fine kind of curvature and, you know, and fine fit together. So they're fairly small, and I think those would work really well to get that kind of dish shape you have on the top, you know, for your palms to fit into.
Yep.
Which I really like that shape. I think that's really nice. You know, I'd finish it off with some hand sanding, and I really like the technique you use to get the blades in, using that flush cut pull saw. that's going to get you really close because you have those teeth all the way to the tip of that. So that was a really smart way to do that. And I think CA glue, or super glue, which is more commonly called, but CA glue or cyanoacrylate glue is a perfect application. This is a perfect application for that. It gets a bad rap a lot. People think of, just super glue it together, because so many people's dads, and moms did that. Yeah, just it seems like a bit of a jerry rig. But it really is a great adhesive, and it holds up well to a lot of abuse. I have it in my shop. I have a two-part, system for it with the accelerator, because sometimes it's really nice to have something stick immediately. You don't want to wait, and that's a great way to do it. So I think that's all really good. What I found really interesting was that without knowing it, you used probably one of the best finishes for this application. We talked about it. Yeah, we talked about it a little bit before, but what you did is actually called Shosugiban, which is a technique for weatherproofing that originated in Japan. And it is charring wood to create a weatherproof material, and then you go over it with a natural oil, and that creates a really durable surface that'll hold up to water and moisture really well. There is some debate amongst woodworkers, especially when you bring Japanese woodworking purists into the mix, who will argue that it's not Shosugiban unless it's done on Japanese cedar.
Okay. Just like champagne isn't champagne unless it's made in France.
Yeah. There's a little bit more of a reason for it, though, than there is with champagne, in my opinion. I'm probably wrong on that. Someone's going to correct me on that. But that's because Japanese cedar actually reacts to that fire treatment a little bit differently, and that the natural sugars in the wood really come out to the surface. And what happens when you melt sugar? You turn it into caramel, essentially, and then it'll harden. Well, that's what's happening in the fibers of the wood, is those sugars are coming to the surface and sealing all of the surface, pores. But it does happen in other woods, just not to the same degree. So anyways, I thought it was really interesting that was the technique you went with, without even really knowing that was probably about one of the best things you could have done.
Yeah, and I mean, really for me, it was just, how can I get a good looking finish without having to sand it, because I'm not a fan of sanding, and I don't think many people are, but it's just one of those things that anytime I can avoid it. And, it's different if there's a prop that I've been working on for 6 months, but, this is one of my projects where it's like, it's in the shop and you need to get out of the shop, and perfection isn't what I'm going for. Those that have watched my YouTube videos know that I'm not aiming ever really for perfection. I'm aiming for good enough. Which as an engineer, that sounds horrible, but in reality, that's my job, is to make it good enough to meet the requirements. We're not making gold-plated bridges, or, that's not what we need to do. We need to make it good enough, safe enough, strong enough, and not really spend any more money than we have to. And I do apply that sometimes to my projects for ones where I'm definitely fixing things. And as I alluded to in the last episode, this kind of project is my favorite. You have an idea, you go out to the workshop, you look around, what have I got? Oh, I've got that. That's a piece of thing that's been sitting around. I've been dragging it around for years. Pull it out. Okay, in your mind, you see this shape, and then within, a couple hours, you've got that shape realized, and then you start putting it together. And yeah, the last thing I wanted to mention was about the CA glue. Is I think it'll be fine on this, because the biggest weakness of a CA glue is its lack of flexibility. So something like a wood glue or a barge cement or something like that, you get some flexibility from that, but the CA glue is quite brittle. And I think with this, there shouldn't be any real flexibility or movement between that metal and the wood. And so it should be fairly solid. And it is a fairly tight press fit as well. So that glue is just kind of just giving a little bit of assistance.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. So my big question is, how's it working?
It works well. It works well. There is obviously a competing plastic one in the drawer, and I do get hurt sometimes when I see that one being used instead of this one. I'm not going to lie, it hurts my soul a little bit, but no, it seems to be working well. You've got to make sure something like this, the blades go as close, as flush as you can. So when you push it down onto the cutting board, there's this minimal amount of the core and that kind of the skin at the bottom. And I think this might have just got a little bit bent, so it comes up a little bit high. But other than that, it works great. And when the kids are up on there, just their whole weight trying to get it to work, and it's like, hey, you're not going to break that one. And if you do, I know how to fix it. So yeah, it's always good when that's that.
Nice.
So Chili,
I like your theory of good enough. When we're working on cars, we call that a car with 20/20 vision. It looks good at 20 feet away at 20 miles an hour.
Yeah, but then it is always fun every now and then to just go that extra where you're like, if somebody really wants to have a look, like if they want to have a look at this piece of clothing and turn it over and look at the seam, they're going to see some perfection right there.
Yep.
So Chili, I have a question for you.
Yes.
What is on your workbench?
Well, I feel slightly obligated to show this, at least briefly, just because you had a kitchen problem, and my kitchen problem arose this week.
Oh no!
Which is we had past tense because it's gone. This plastic scraper that we used on the stoneware that we have, so like stone baking sheets, and we were on like our third or fourth one. They don't hold up well, even just in hot water. Like they get soft and then lose their shape. So I made some out of wood.
Oh wow!
So it's just scrap walnut that I had around. And I was sick of dealing with that cruddy plastic one. So I was like, all right, it's time for a kitchen solution in the Orwood shop. But the majority of what I've been working on has actually been this little bugger over here, which used to be a 15 panel, glazed door. So there were 15 glass panels in it. And these are actually painted ceramic tiles. So my client had her kids and her grandkids all make these ceramic tiles for Christmas. And then she decided she wanted a way to display them outside. She wants to put it outside. So I was looking at it over at her house, and I found this old door from the house, and I was like, what's your plan with this? She's like, nothing. It's been sitting here for 10 years. So I said, well, can I take it? And so I took it and cut it down, to make it work for these tiles. The interesting thing I found, I thought the door was much older than it turned out to be. So I was expecting when I took it apart that the stiles here, like these dividers in between, would have tenons going into the rails and stiles of the door, and only one side of the was so that you could remove that trim and take a broken piece of glazing out, which glazing is just what they call glass. When it's in a door or window, it's called glazing. So that's what I was expecting, but I found that it was actually a much newer door. So it had these are the dividers, which means what they did was they profiled each corner and then ran this groove in. So they built three sides of the door, put two of the stiles on one rail, and then all of the panes and dividers were actually stacked in. So if a pane ever breaks, the only way to fix it is to take the entire door apart, which is ludicrous. So that's what I found. So I took it apart, and then what I did was on the back side, I took a chisel, and I guess it should go this way. I took a chisel and removed the bulk of the waste material that was one of the decorative edges, and then I ran down that with a rabbit or a rebate plane to smooth it all out and get it good. So on the pieces, there's actually both these back sides are gone, so it's just a straight piece of wood coming out the back, and that allowed me to actually slide the glazing in from the back, as well as the matting and the tiles, and then eventually the backer boards, so they essentially work like a picture frame.
Yep.
So it's like 6 picture frames in one piece. And it was pretty straightforward after that. It was really just putting it back together, cleaning the glass. There were like 3 different attempts at painting the door, which ended up with paint on the glass. Clean that up, get the matting cut, which I hate. I hate matting.
What do you mean by the matting, I guess?
So this stuff around the tile, that when you're framing a picture.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And you have the kind of colored paper around it. That's called matting.
Yep.
And it's not fun to do without all the fancy tools. I did it with an X-Acto knife and a straight edge.
That's how I do it.
Yeah, there may have been some errors and some pieces remade.
Yep.
But yeah, it was pretty straightforward after I got those back pieces taken care of. And what I'm debating now is she wants to hang it outside, and really sturdy, because it's got a lot of weight to it. I mean, it's heavy.
Yeah. So I guess just to make sure I've got an understanding, you've basically got, it was originally a door and you cut it down to shape it. And then you put the glass back in, but on the back side, where normally you would have just slid the glass in basically in those router cuts, you basically had that so that the glass would still slide in, but on the back you could start attaching things and then have a backing board up against it. And you would have the glass with the matting, with a tile, with a backing board kind of thing, and you've got that all sealed up. Okay. Yeah, I think I was a bit confused because I thought when you said tile, the tile was just kind of mounted on there. But yeah, with that glass, it's a lot more complex than I was originally thinking.
Yeah, it was a little tricky at first. I scratched my head a bit when I went, oh, well, this isn't what I was expecting. And then just looking at, the pieces themselves, I said, well, it's really not going to take much to turn that into what I thought it was.
Yep.
So yeah, I think getting all the back trim off, doing the chisel and router or chisel and plane work, maybe half an hour.
Oh wow!
Once I had an idea, okay, this is what I'm doing. Yeah, it doesn't really take long, and honestly, had I used a power router to do that, it would have taken me just as long. Once you go through setup, getting everything dialed in, on your router, so that you don't have as much wiggle room when you're using a power tool like that. It takes a lot of time to get your setup done correctly. And then it's that final bit of actually running the pieces through that goes really quick. Whereas doing it with hand tools, it's more of a gradual process, but I have wiggle room. Like I'm not as likely to screw a piece up.
But you've got that time. You've got that you can feel the wood as it's working underneath you, and you go, oh, something's not right. I need to stop. And with power tools, it's either going to do it or it's not, and you just hope. And you've done your prep work, and once you start, it's at the end you're like, oh, that wasn't even close to right. And do what I didn't have to run to the hardware store and pick up a whole bunch of wood because you messed up. But anyway, it happens. So
it does.
I do have a question. How did you end up mounting? because like normally in a picture frame, right, you're obviously dealing usually with like a picture or a photo or something that's fairly light, and you've got your glass, and you either just, in my case, I'll just use some like acid-free tape and tape it to the matting, or just use friction of like the backing board to hold it in place. How are you holding those tiles in place so they don't kind of move over time with respect to the matting?
I used a foam core matting that is the same thickness as the tiles.
Oh, okay, yep. And
so the tiles are actually sitting inside the matting.
Nice. Yeah, I actually did something similar for some cross stitches that my mother gave. It's a way of mounting a cross stitch is that if you basically cut a perfect square, obviously you haven't lost any material, like if you were sawing something. And so if you put the cross stitch over it, as you're pushing the outer frame over it, it actually stretches the cross stitch. And if you're using like an acid-free or an archival foam, that's it. You don't have to sit there and stretch it and tape it and do all things like that. So yeah, fascinating that's how you did that.
That's a good idea. So you're almost doing the same thing that you do, with a round spring form as you're doing needlework.
Yeah, exactly. Except it's just kind of a way of doing it at the end. And I haven't had any issues with the ones that I've done like that, compared to, because otherwise you end up using like a canvas stretcher or something, and you got to try and stretch it evenly. And yeah, it can be done, or you've got to use thread, and that's not too much work. But I saw that technique and gave it a shot. And
nice.
Yeah, I guess I had one. I noticed that you've painted it, so obviously for weather, painting is the 100% way to go. Paint lasts up way better in the environment to any natural finish. With the glass, I guess sitting outside, is there any concern that, it looks like the tiles have been painted on, and with the mat, is there any concern that like sunlight will eventually fade any of that? Or I guess, is there any, like, what have you got in place to do it? Because I know that with like acrylics, the acrylics will yellow over time, but that will kind of save your artwork underneath, while like a glass, it can kind of weather that through.
Yeah. So these tiles, it's not actually paint that's on them. It is pigmented glaze.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And then there's a clear glaze over it. So ceramic, glaze doesn't really, it's not affected the same way as paints are by UV. So it shouldn't be a problem, but it is probably going to go somewhere that is somewhat protected.
Yeah.
There's going to be some shade and overhang, which, I asked some questions about that when she said she wanted it to go outside, and I was like, are you sure about that? But that's also why I have the back on it like I do, because you can easily remove it and clean the glass, clean anything, because as protected as it is and as sealed as it is, you're still going to get intrusion of dust into it. That's going to be the biggest problem with it being outside.
Yeah. Unfortunately, in Denver, you're got a pretty dry climate, so you shouldn't have to worry about any weird things growing in there, and it's pretty protective. While here it'd be there's going to be like moss growing in there and a possum in there and something else like a few minutes later. But
but in all fairness, I've discovered through your videos that possums in Australia are much cuter than they are here.
They're still just as much of a pain. I've actually had to go through and get wire mesh roll in my workshop, because I think in 3 weeks I had 3 different possums, and it was like, there's clearly some gaps that need to be filled, and I haven't had any residents since, so it's always good.
Our possums look like if your possums were on meth.
Yeah, I can see that. I never actually remember seeing any of your type of possums when I was over there. Plenty of raccoons and other creepy crawlies, but no possums. So.
Yeah, you didn't miss anything.
Well, thanks for sharing with what's on your workbench. I guess, how long have you been working on that one? It sounds like it must have been a fairly quick project for you.
Yeah, I think it was about, it gets spaced out because of, dry time for paint, and I jump over on another project. But I think I have like 4 hours maybe in it at most. It didn't take much.
it's good. They're always good projects.
Yeah, it's I mean, that's part of the nice thing about starting with you know, a reclaimed, you know, piece like a door, is that if you pick your reclaimed pieces well, they will reduce your time, you know, in the final piece. If you choose your reclaimed materials poorly, it will double the amount of time.
Yep. Yeah, I love reclaimed things, especially like a door, because you've got that history and that life already there, and you get that free. You know, you're not having to manufacture, you know, this life behind it or this character, or, you know, wait 20 years for that to come. It's kind of already there, which is always good.
Yeah. Usually the hardest part of reclaimed materials is when you want to do something, or your client wants something that is more highly polished. You know, they don't necessarily want to see that story, which was the case with this one. But thankfully, the piece was in really good shape when I got it. So I didn't have to like strip all the old paint off. That would have been a nightmare. I hate doing that. Because really your only options for doing that are you know, are manual sanding, you know, with sandpaper around a form, you know, to get in all that tiny detail. And most people don't want to pay for that anyways, thankfully.
Yeah, no, we had a cupboard that we dragged around, and it was about 5 years in. I was like, yep, this needs to be stripped back. And it got to a point where there was just bits of white embedded in the grain, and it was like around these, and I'm just like, that's just part of the history of the piece. So now it's all varnished up and sits there, and it's like, you know what, I like walking past and I see those little bits of white, and I'm just like, yep, that's part of its history. So the client in that case was very forgiving.
Yeah, I mean, unless you're working on a piece that has, you know, significance as, you know, an art or architectural piece, I don't think it's necessary to get all of that, you know, gone.
And even then, I think unless there was some malicious intent done with the damage, that's part of the history. Like, you look at any historical, say, building, and we look at it modernly and go, oh, that's that building, that's how it must have been for hundreds of years. And then you look back and you're like, oh no, they did a remodel 200 years ago, they did a remodel 400 years ago, like an old castle. And then it's like historians have these real big problems about, well, we want to restore it, but where do we restore it? Because if we restore it to 500 years ago versus 300 years ago, we lose some of the history. And it's a real, how do you do that? And it's kind of, I guess, a real big question when it comes to restoring things.
Yeah, I think especially in the architectural world.
Oh yeah.
You know, the one thing for me, which is a personal preference, is anybody who paints over gorgeous, meticulous trim work in a house. Like, if you look at the corners of your doors and they have rosettes or bullseyes there, and you choose to paint over that, you need to be slapped. Because
I can
it
get
is
behind
not
that
easy to
policy.
undo that.
Yep. Yeah, I can get behind that policy. All right. Well, it sounds like we're a bit rambling now, which is always good, but let's save some discussions for future episodes. So can you give us a hint, Chili, of what is going to be on your workbench next week? Or is it so quickly you not get it? Is your workbench a bit different to mine, where mine projects sit for months at a time?
I think what I'm gonna talk about next week is I think I'm gonna be working on Katie's pottery bench.
Oh, I'm very curious.
Yeah, I'm hoping to get that done next week. So hopefully that should be around to talk about a little bit.
Wow. Yeah, I've got Harry Potter wand. Well, it's not Harry's wand, it's Luna's wand, her second wand. I have a wand thing going on my channel where videos do really well and they're really fun to make. So I just was like, I'm sick of doing house projects. I'm doing something completely useless and pointless because I want to. And it's been staring at me. I'm looking at right now. But I'm hoping to finish that off this weekend. So hopefully we will have a bit of a discussion about that, because I'm sure you have some thoughts on wood types and finishes for that, which I can't wait to talk about.
Ooh.
So if people want to find more about you, Chili, where can they find more?
Yes, you can find me on Facebook or YouTube at Orwood Solutions, or on Instagram at Orwood CS. How about you?
So for me, if you want to find more, most of my stuff is on YouTube. Craftybeetroot.com is the website. But if you search Crafty Beetroot on YouTube, you'll come up with a lot of my videos. So we haven't quite got the details of where this podcast exists yet finalized. We are doing a bit of pre-recording to get ourselves set up. We will have all those details in the description, and you'll be able to find these eventually on your regular podcast apps like Apple, whatever Apple podcast is. I don't use Apple products, so that was a bad one. But yeah, and we'll also have all these videos on YouTube as well, under What's on Your Workbench. So with that, we will see you next week, and we'll find out what's on your workbench.